as well as the director of the Center for the Study of African Economics. He combines a stellar academic career with one as a policy advisor. He was chief economist of the Department of International Development, the department responsible for the UK's government aid policy and spending. He also served as development policy advisor to successive foreign secretaries at the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and 2020 and 2022. Such was his contribution to this field that in 2018, the late Queen Elizabeth II awarded him as an honorary companion of the Most Distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George for his services to economics and development. Now, Stefan's research into and the role of history and politics in this. His latest book, Gambling on Development, Why Some Countries Win and Others Lose, draw on his academic and policy experience over 3 decades in more than 40 countries, and is one of the most insightful books in development economics that I've read in recent years, and I must admit, one of the very few that I managed to read in the end. And I'm sure many of you will agree with me that books on development economics are not always an easy read. Now, this book gives real-life examples on why some countries prosper while others fail, and the role of elites in reaching the development bargain to ensure that conditions are in place for growth. We have made copies of the book available, and I do highly encourage everybody to grab a copy and read it. Malaysia is at a transition point, faced with both external and a refreshed development.
An important part of it. So it's not because I don't believe people don't have the power to try to change things. It's because elites have the powers to stop change from happening. And it's a bit where I want to talk to you about. So I talk around the title, you know, can it be renewed? Can it be enhanced here in Malaysia? But I will mainly spend my time to try to explain the idea and how it may actually, or how the organizers may have been totally right to actually think there is an issue here as well that we need to start thinking about and to actually enhance and renew the development bargaining. By the way, a lot of it, what I will say about Malaysia, is going to be very positive, okay? Don't you worry, there's a lot of positive things. And I didn't have it in my book, because actually there's quite a lot of positive things to be said. But it doesn't mean this renewal is important. And that's what I will want to come to at the end. So let me give you quickly some facts here. So, you know, in my book, as I said, I don't write about Malaysia. I write about a series of countries that, especially in the last decades, 3-4 decades, which is a period of dramatic change in the world economy, we're actually very fast growth of middle-income countries. And on average, middle-income countries grew by about 3.5% since 1990 in per capita terms, so taking into account population growth. And then you know the winners, you know, some of them are there, you know, China, India started taking off, Bangladesh, you know, typecast by Henry Kissinger in 1980 as a basket case, is becoming one of the fastest growing economies and really excelling also in development progress. We have places like Indonesia, of course, but also you get other ones that you may not realize, like Ghana or Ethiopia in the African region, that there are places that begin to do it. But there's also losers. Probably for me, in my studies, Nigeria, and I come back to it, why this is a little bit relevant for Malaysia as well. Nigeria, really in the end, going, being quite stagnant. Or the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has succeeded since 1960 to reduce the GDP per capita by about half. So it's actually a downward trajectory over decades and decades. So I want to explain some of these things. Now, where does Malaysia fit into it? Well, you know it does pretty well. And if you go back since 1960, it's actually quite helpful not just to look where you end, which is, you know, converging in GDP per capita and constant prices towards where China is. And you get, of course, Thailand, Indonesia, countries that are progressing as well. And you have a bunch of places that seem to be more stagnant, but it's actually quite helpful where they started. You know, GDP per capita of Malaysia was a bit similar to Nigeria, was actually quite similar to Ghana, to Democratic Republic of Congo as well, and actually similar to the Philippines as well at the time. So Malaysia is clearly one of these most successful places. Others, like Indonesia, or go towards India or China, they were considerably poorer in that period. So if we look at the kind of progress that some of these countries that were similar at the time, you know, then of course Malaysia's relative success also stands out quite a lot. You know, similar to Ghana and Nigeria, and you struggle even on this picture to actually see where they ended in that period. Even Ghana in recent periods has been quite successful. But you get also countries that clearly hasn't been in the neighborhood. Philippines, of the longer term, wasn't really as successful, although it's helpful for where we are today to actually look at it in the context since what happened since 98. And since 98, mean growth in middle-income countries has been, of course, again, being very spectacular. But that's dominated by some of these large economies like China and India and indeed Bangladesh. Now, actually, we're getting here the countries in the region here, including Malaysia, not really being as excellent. And since 98, there is something here. And that's what I want to allude to. There is something here that we actually need to think a bit about it. Still some of the same losers, you know. You're not at all typecast. I said a lot what I would say. Most of the time, I spent a lot of time in places like Pakistan or Nigeria. I need to tell them, you know, elite, you've actually blocked progress and you're actually going backwards. And it's a very simple diagnosis, which unfortunately people then totally recognize and agree with. My thing in the book, in my writings, is I want to understand, though, why is it these differences? Because the countries I've been naming are very different in histories, in initial conditions, in structures, in politics, and so on and so on. And so, of course, it's an important question to try to understand. And I think it's important also here to understand it, you know, why is Malaysia in this group over the longer term or also in recent times? You know, what is it that it has in common maybe with Bangladesh or India in recent times? Or indeed Ghana in recent times that's doing quite well, or indeed China, Indonesia. You know, yeah, there's similarities and you can name them. There's also important differences. And that's actually what I want to, you know, get you a sense of, that explaining this is not that easy. You know, there's a very famous and deservedly famous book, Why Nations Fail, by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson, you know. And they take this view that, you know, a big, very long-term explanation of progress and success and failure, and somehow, you know, they say it's all about institutional development. You know, and countries that have perfect institutions, where they think about property rights, but also economic governance, rule of law, no corruptions, democratic systems. Say in the long term, these are the dominant countries. And in the long term, you know, if we take several centuries, you know, England does reasonably well. And in fact, the book is a bit like, you know, as long as you look a bit like England and some of its offshoots, you're quite successful, you know, America and so on. And so it's a particular way of looking at this longer term. But it's actually quite a challenging explanation to understand takeoff and progress in recent decades. You know, I like my institutions to be reliable and predictable and all these things. But if I look around Bangladesh or China or Indonesia, I don't observe perfect institutions. You know, there's plenty of stuff on economic governance, on transparency of politics, on corruption that is present there. So you actually get quite a lot of success in recent times in very imperfect places. Actually, that helps me because it's quite a positive message for a lot of countries in the world. You don't have to wait for this perfection to actually take off. In fact, you don't have to wait until you look enough like England in the 19th century for the beginning to take off. You know, and it's always been a bit of a tricky thing because this book, like Why Nations Fail, takes a long-term historical view. Which must mean that if I go to places like, which I often do, to Nigeria, and I go and talk to the leadership there, probably my best message to tell them is, you know what, if you want to be successful, why don't you get yourself a better history? It's a bit tricky, especially when I work for the UK government, to go and tell countries that. So you have a bit of a very negative thing. If it's all history, we're all stuck. But actually here, we actually say, well, no, we have countries that take off, do quite well, within imperfection, in all kinds of ways. The same actually would be applied in terms of political systems. You know, there's a tendency sometimes when you come and flying from London or from Washington to say, look, there's one political system that will deliver it all. You know, I'm a Democrat and I like my democracy. I like the idea of choosing my leaders. I don't like to be told who my leader should be, but if I'm, as an analyst, look at progress across countries in the world in the last 3-4 decades, we actually find an interesting finding, which is, on average, autocracies did as well as democracies. On average, autocracies did the same. However, there's one difference, and I will tell you, me as a bit more democratic person, helps me. The variance amongst autocracies is much wider. Or put it differently, some of the best performers are autocracies, but some of the worst ones, like the DRC, are also autocracies. So there is something there that we can say, but it's not about average growth. There's something about the spread. So there is something there, but again, you don't need to wait for perfection or a particular narrow political model, a particular way of looking at for getting success. So it's quite, you know, diverse where it comes from. In fact, it even goes further. The World Bank, with a lot of other support from other donors, about 15 years ago, brought together some of arguably the best minds in growth and thinking about growth. You know, one of the main people was Robert Solow, one of the fathers of growth theory, if anyone who's had to do a bit of economics courses, but also people like Michael Spence, a Nobel Prize winner as well, and he was chairing this commission. And they looked at countries that over a very long period, 50 years, had actually been successful in growth. And they were looking at what do they have in common. For them to have to conclude in terms of economic policies, and Robert Solow famously said that, you know, yes, I've spent my life working on growth, and I look at places like Bangladesh and so on, and what do I tell them? Well, the best I can say, we know the ingredients of growth, but we don't know the recipe. There is no single recipe for success. Now, it's again, that's a positive story. And that's also what we see. Countries found within their own constraints, and and of course that's where politics and structures will come into, they found ways of actually finding the economic policy environment that then helps them to make progress in a particular way. So, you know, it's not just simply the system, but probably what you do with it in politics. It's also not simply the institutions, but finding ways of actually making it work within the imperfection. And then actually in policies, there's actually quite a lot of choice possible. You know, the chairman, I was delighted to hear him say growth is a choice. Actually, this is what we mean by growth is a choice. You know, within your imperfections, there are paths that every country can find to progress, very different places. Of course, there is a set within that choice that will spell disaster. Can't I help it, just say the name Liz Truss again. But, you know, there are things, policy choices, that actually will not help you to progress. I call this unreasonable. If you have a choice set that is reasonable, so why do you pick the ones that are unreasonable? So what did the Growth Commission conclude? They say, well, you know, you need some form of macroeconomic stability. Stability matters. There's no investment incentives that can ever work in a total macroeconomic stability. You know, you need to be sufficiently outward-oriented, you know, taking some of the prices in the world as given, you know, outward-oriented and trying to compete with it. And then you need to do sensible things in health, in education, in infrastructure. That's what they said. So this is the set of reasonable policies that they had. Now the question then becomes, why is it that some countries pick within this broad set of reasonable policies unreasonable ones? Or why is it sometimes so hard to actually make the corrections to make it a bit more reasonable when unreasonableness sets in? And that's, in a way, the real thing that needs to be explained. If there's choice, why bad choices are being made and not more sensible ones come forward? So this is, for me, also in the book, and this is where the concept of a development bargain in a moment will come into it, is to actually think, you know, why is it that we settle in some places on unreasonable outcomes, Nigeria, DRC, maybe Myanmar, and why do we settle in other places in actually reasonable things, maybe not perfect, but making progress one way or another. And this is where the role of the elite bargain comes into it. The concept probably can be traced back to another Nobel Prize winner, Douglas North, who wrote one of his last books, actually, or the last book he wrote with a few others, with Weingast and Wallace. He wrote about violence and social orders, and he was interested in the origins of the state. How do states emerge? And you know, it's a long tradition in economic history and history in general that state structures emerge to contain violence, to create some form of peace and stability. Okay? That's a long tradition across lots of intellectual traditions thinking about it as well. But they are economists, economic historians, and they actually say, well, how do they overcome it? Well, they tend to overcome the problem of violence by getting somehow a coalition of dominant forces, of elite groups, somehow willing to say, well, we make a deal with each other in return for something. And what is in return for something? It's access to resources, access to the state, access to activities. And that's, in a way, you can think about historically the emergence of the state. In fact, we can go further, that at any moment in time, it is helpful to think of any society you observe as somehow a deal between dominant groups about how you get access to the state, how you get access to resources, how you get access to activities. Okay? And that's an important thought. So, and this is where politics and economics comes together. Politics is a reflection of that deal-making, but there's an economic deal underlying in it. And that's, in a way, in my book, I wanted to not just bring it into history, but actually into the here and now. And thinking, somehow, that every society, you should understand it as a deal between the people of influence and the people of power. Okay, so most of you here, okay? So you have one way or another. You may not be in power, but you have power. You are definitely influence. And you're part of this elite in that sense that can shape it. So the elite is not just the religious leader or the king, or the kings. No, it's not like that. It's actually broader. It's those people with power and influence in politics, in the bureaucracy, the civil administration, the businesses, the religious leaders, civil servants, intellectuals, journalists, a broad group of people is actually there in it. And in some sense, you can think of any moment in time, they make a particular deal of peace and stability. In fact, when you have deep fractures in the elites, as in some countries, well, you don't have stability. It's that basic minimal amount of deal. But it is always not just a political deal, an economic deal. And these things come together. This is important because the way you end up doing economics and economic activity, business activity, is conditioned by the nature of that political deal. But the way you do politics is going to be conditioned of who actually has the resources and actually how they get interlinked. So this is how it all links then together. So you could have lots of elite bargains. You could have an elite bargain that is simply saying, look, if I control the state, I have a license to steal. A kleptocracy. Unfortunately, if I go to Kinshasa, to the DRC, I have to tell the elite, unfortunately, that is your elite deal. If you control the state, you can just steal without any risk of punishment, total impunity around it. You have 54 tax-raising authorities, and a business doesn't know which one will knock on the door, and they can always put in a claim, and it's usually a round number in dollars, and you just have to pay it. And then they say, oh, if you don't, we bring some soldiers. And I know from an experience of a firm in Eastern Congo, well, then the way to avoid that is you hire some other soldiers to guard your business for that day, and then there's a standoff between the two, and then they usually go away. But it costs you money, and that's kleptocracy, that's stealing, that's not just corruption, that's stealing, that's what's going on there. We could also have, and far more common, whether you go to the United States or to Britain, or you go to many of the countries, virtually all the countries I raised that made progress, you actually tend to have something that is patronage-based and also clientelist. Let me explain the word clientelist. It's basically a political system where in return for being in power, you need to reward people for their loyalty, and that could be people and businesses, with jobs, with benefits, with subsidies, with contracts and all things. And somehow it's a transactional way. Look, a lot of democracies, or things that we call, but also other systems, tend to have an element of that. And it's quite important to recognize that. It's part of the way, political power is established and maintained. In the UK, during COVID, unfortunately, we saw it strongly in action, where connected businesses got all the contracts. We see it in America through lobbying and interests. You get laws voted in Parliament in all kinds of ways. You get it within one-party states. You get it in all kinds of ways where these things may work. And so you could have an elite bargain that is in that sense transactional. The power is there, but I'll need to get that concession, otherwise you will not get the support I need to get here. So and this is now where it then gets different. Within all these imperfections, how do you get an elite bargain for development then? Well, it's actually relatively straightforward, but it's definitely empirically is what you observe. Somehow or another, the drive for growth, for expansion of the pie, also for making it somewhat inclusive, is strong enough even within these imperfections. Okay? So allow me to say a few things on what happened in China. Now, lots of things happened, of course, in the 1970s, but China had an economic system arguably run based on ideology, on dogma, before 1979. And it was also in turmoil. After Cultural Revolution, the death of Mao, the Gang of Four, I'm old enough to, at least from where I was sitting, people would say, will China survive or not? But the way to think about it is that within the party, Deng Xiaoping, but many others as well, brokered a deal, formed a dominant coalition, to actually go around the way they were operating in politics and the economy in a different way. And an interesting way, actually to make it, rather than making an economy based on patronage, making an economy based on pragmatism. Doesn't matter whether the cat is white or black, as long as it catches mice. And actually, also, not so much just because, forgive me to put it like this, everybody loved deeply the people and so on. It was also important to keep power. It was important to keep power, to have legitimacy towards the population. So it was about growth, expanding the power of the nation, and also a lot to do with food security. And so this expansion is actually a bit like, we actually get a coalition where within all the ways we are going about within our own context, growth is a central part of how we progress. It's essentially a lead bargain within the party for growth and development. Now, India, it's totally different. There you had an elite bargain for the economy with huge controls and rents, the license Raj, as they used to call it. Actually, a lot of pressure saying, look, this doesn't grow the pie. This is actually just status quo. This is distribution amongst people with influence and power in connection to the state. So actually it took a long time in the 1980s, all the way to Manmohan Singh as finance minister, being able to push through, on the back of a crisis, a balance of payments crisis, to actually push through liberalization. He was confident from day one that this would stick. Everybody else was worried about it. He made these speeches, which were fascinating to read. It took them well into the 1990s before all political parties began to embrace it. BJP, I think it was 96, that actually it was more or less agreeing with it, having done the reforms in 91. And of course now, politics is fought around growth and progress, and not just about the kind of system as we had, with all its imperfection. Bangladesh, similarly, mid-1970s, turmoil, independence war, a famine in the 1970s, political violence, two political families that really, forgive me to put it like this, hate each other's guts, and really fighting it out. Within this, getting an element of consensus going on. In the 1980s and 90s, having been called a basket case, you get an emergence of a garment industry, you get an emergence of civil society with NGOs delivering incredible organizations like BRAC, development programs. You're getting actually an implicit consensus, even though politics is fractured, making progress. And we can continue. The phases in Indonesia, first in the 1970s, getting Japanese investment in Indonesia, and then after 98, the changes, the deepening of the political deal as well. That's where it contrasts with these other places. The deal stuck to status quo and no change. Of course, this is where I put Malaysia, is that actually historically, you somehow or another, with all its imperfection, managed to settle on a development bargain in these early phases. And this is where I will now for a moment develop it further. But you can't just say, it's not about the leader saying, I want development. Every leader basically will stand up in New York in the General Assembly and say, I'm totally committed to development, I'm totally committed to the Sustainable Development Goals and whatever. It's not just words. You have to actually understand why would they actually do it in the first instance, and then what would they do. So why would the elite move towards these kind of objectives? Well, we would hope they do it out of conviction, and conviction politics still exists. It's not always the case. I think it's a lot to do, often, with, in many countries, it came about out of seeking legitimacy as well. I would say in China or in Indonesia, it had a lot to do in the early phases with legitimacy. We need to actually do progress in growth, allow new firms to come in, new businesses, get the people to benefit more. It's part of it. Of course, you would say, why don't you do it? The pie gets bigger. If I'm interested in patronage and lining my pockets to some extent, when the pie is bigger with growth, why wouldn't I do it? And this is where the book was called Gambling on Development. Because actually, for the elite, you know exactly how to do business in this at the moment. Anything that changes possibly the way you have to act. Or put it differently, the elite understands the status quo. Sri Lanka was fascinating. Once they now had to start doing some reforms after, the crisis and the whole thing, and suddenly business had to start paying taxes because tax to GDP ratio had to drop dramatically or whatever. It was fascinating to talk to a business leader and say, gosh, it's really difficult for us now because we used to know how to do business in Sri Lanka, and now actually there is change. And so this is the kind of thing you allude to. This is a gamble for us as well, because some elite players will lose, and new elite players will emerge with growth and development. When you get an educated population, there will be other demands, and it's challenging the status quo. The status quo is the power of the elite. Okay. And then, it cannot just be words. It has to be underlying also a real commitment to peace and stability, but there's more to that. The state, within different countries, will play a bigger or a smaller role. Actually, the more I look at it, I can't say in general whether you want to have a small state or a big state. If I have a state that for thousands of years or so, or definitely for more than a millennium, had actually very centralized state with central tax raising powers, with meritocratic bureaucracy, like China, like Korea, like Japan, state-led development probably will work. If I go to a state that actually has a very early history of state formation and coming out of maybe colonial times, not like that, like a Bangladesh, it's going to be much harder to do state-led development because you don't really have that state that's built up. For me, the most important thing is know what state you have, how well your state can do. I call it the self-aware state that knows what to do in the circumstances, but also knows what not to do. The progress in Bangladesh, to a large extent in the 1980s, had to do with the state becoming somewhat less ambitious and actually withdrew. While in other countries, the state keeping the lead was part of the success. Self-awareness is important. And then finally, you have to be willing to learn. And learning typically is through forms of accountability. External accountability through the political system, or internal accountability. It's definitely, as it was done, the governance reforms in China in the late 1970s, early 80s, had a lot to do with making internal accountability count. And that's how you should think about it, a civil service, party leaders being held to account, and that actually is then ways. You need to be able to learn. Okay. Let me then, last 5 minutes, 10 minutes, tell you my initial thoughts on Malaysia that you can disagree with. So where are you now? So I built this up, and where are we now? Well, remember, it's about, think of a state as a bargain between those with power and influence. Okay? Many of you here. And basically, it's broad. It's not just politicians, and then the business community is something else. It's all intertwined. I'm sorry, it's all intertwined. Often you get the private sector that the politics deserves. You get the politics that is deserved by the economy, and so on. So these things are linked. So what is that dominant coalition here? What does the deal look like? Now, in a very simplified way, I would say, look, I can recognize already two faces, and I'm hoping for a third one. In line also what the organizers were thinking about here. So there's two phases. I would say, up to the Asian financial crisis, and then what came afterwards, which is since 1998, with 2018 clearly an important moment as well, up to now. And then the question is really, can you get a third phase here? And that's really where the question is. So let me simply summarize it, and forgive me, I'm blunt, okay? I will say it as I think it is. You have a political deal. Let me not go too deeply in it, but it's an interesting one based on race and religions included on it. It's a particular political deal, okay? It works, by the way, and it has worked. But it's, not easily seen as, is that the only one could have? But it's there. You have an economic deal that I would say, since 1960s, has become deeply clientelist and patronage-based. Actually, the politics requires it. It's based the politics required to do this and to keep maybe the stability. And I can understand it. A lot of capitalism based on ownership of land, land-based capitalism, plantation agricultures, all these kind of things, real estate in later times. And then extensive rent distribution happens in the economy. You know, state-owned enterprises, they're just part of the rent system. They're not necessarily, nobody will ever say they are necessarily, in all their cases, the most efficient way of organizing the factors of production. But they're part of the system. And it's very hard to do it. The ideas of concessions and contracts to friendly partners, it's there. Of course, there is space for the multinationals, and it's really important that actually, you know, you have a thriving export-oriented industry as well. That is on the frontier of doing it. And you know, that's part of it. You know, if you think of one of these conditions with macro stability combined with a sufficient outward orientation, it's part of a development bargain, and it works. It has worked quite well. Is it inclusive for the people? Well, it's still a form of rent distribution. This is not a sophisticated inclusive economy, by the way. This is a lot to do through subsidies, benefits, and so on. And then there's a national narrative that has held it together. And it's complicated, but quite effective. Okay? And I think these are these ingredients. You know, there's a politics and economics. It somehow has worked very well. So despite the imperfections, I think, you know, if I had to write a new chapter and say this is a country that definitely had a development bargain, that was quite strong and made a lot of progress in that. Sufficient growth incentives. So this was not just the status quo, there was enough incentive to grow the pie, which is the key part here. Where are we then now? Well, you know, it's still essentially a similar political deal. It's not necessarily, you know, totally inclusive, but it's definitely more open. Okay, there's definitely more open. There's more forces. It creates risks. You know, there's new vested interests that become stronger and make the politics more complicated. I don't think I have to explain that the politics is complicated here. The economic deal. You know, with an economy that grows and gets increasingly more complex, that's where the challenge now lies. The politics required that clientelist, patronage-based economy, but actually, it gets more expensive. Patronage increasingly becomes more expensive. There's efficiency losses. You get the state-owned enterprises. You have multinationals, but actually the linkages are not that strong with the export-oriented business. So it's not changing the productivity frontier, really, of Malaysian capital. Capital is not really moving that much more towards tradables. It's still very much a resource-based tradables and non-tradables. So is it inclusive? Again, it's not very well targeted. The state is big, but actually only a third of transfers, for example, via the social assistance program, goes to the poorest 20%. That's actually pretty poor performance of your distributive systems. Inequality only goes down by 2 points, from something like, I think, 0.43 to 0.41, based on any form of redistribution. That is amongst the lowest in the world. That actually, the inefficiency of your social systems. It's expensive, and it's terribly inefficient. So that's need for renewal. So, you know, there is a development bargain, but I do think it needs to become more inclusive. It has to be more developmental. Of course, the commitment to peace and stability is still there, and I wouldn't dream of trying to suggest you want to tinker with this. But it's still, there's a lot there that's a weight on the economy. The non-tradable sector, the state-owned enterprises, the subsidies, the patronage. That's something you have to carry on and will help to explain. It knocks off something considerable of your growth performance. And then, you know, can the state learn? Well, to some extent, but it's probably not learning as fast as it should do. And actually, there's still a lot that actually could be improved in terms of internal accountability. And we know, of course, the external accountability, political accountability has definitely improved, and it's there. So how do we know that change is happening? What do you want to see? Well, it's courage, basically. It's addressing some of these vested interests in the sense of a bargain between different groups. A bargain means give and take a bit, and finding a balance to say, look, can we set ourselves between society, civil society, between civil service, public administration, business, and the politics in a way that you can set yourself more. And I have some ideas there, you know. A state that is more self-aware is definitely part of it. You know, a bit more creative destruction would probably help. And probably improve quality and make it more inclusive education, because your people will now have to be the ones that help to drive your productivity frontier. And then dealing with the accountability. You know, not just saying, oh, we'll do some corruption things or whatever. You know, it's more than corruption. Subsidies, tax breaks, all these kind of concessions, that's often a much larger cost to the economy than just the limited sense of it's just going after corrupt behavior, which of course I don't condone either. And then for the leadership, it's actually brokering these deals. And it's actually for all of us, and including organizations like Hazanat, to actually be part of actually brokering these deals and use your position there in it. I will stop now. As I said, you know, I said positive things, but I do want to challenge, because I am concerned that that next phase may be forming, but it also may not do it. And if it doesn't form, and if the elite basically says, we actually like this status quo the way it works now, I think growth performance will go down, the society will be less inclusive, and all these challenges thrown to us by geopolitics and the changing global economy, well, you actually end up maybe just about high income, but essentially still stuck in what people used to call a middle income trap. And that's the big risk that you have. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Stefan, for a most insightful session. I think you have left us with much food of thought. And after this very insightful session, I think the audience here must be, you know, dying to ask you some questions. If we can take some questions on the floor. Sir, the gentleman over here.
But for the online people.
Hello. Thank you, Professor, for a most stimulating and challenging talk. My name is Chu Seng Kop of Zico. I'm part of the advisors to the elite for 4 prime ministers over the years. But I do have 2 questions, and I think it's very interesting. I won't talk about Malaysia because there are very good people here. I was involved in Myanmar when President Thein Sein did a fantastic reform. My former partner, Dr. Mao Montien, was the Deputy Minister of Finance, doing a lot of reforms. And suddenly, the military pushed back, and everything was unraveled. I was also involved in the 1997 crisis when Suharto was tossed out, partly because of the external forces that was beyond his control. The point I'm trying to get at, the elites change amongst themselves. So in the case of Thein Sein, he was tossed out because they felt he was too liberal. In the case of Suharto, they felt he was too accommodating to the West. So my question is, how do you ensure, because I'm not talking about Malaysia, I'm not an expert on that. I feel guilty actually listening to what you say. The point I'm trying to get is, how do you ensure that the elites that are there today, or was there before, will continue in a more inclusive manner? Because in the case of Myanmar, they just tossed out and went backwards. In the case of Indonesia, it went well, but after a while. So the elites are not necessarily always there. How do you ensure that there's a wider participation of elites so that everybody benefits? And pardon me if I was being rude about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we take a few? Maybe?
Okay, sure. Maybe if we can combine a few questions together, if anybody with another question. Anybody from the floor? Oh yeah, someone over there.
Hi, hello. Hi, Stefan. It's Brian here. Hello. I'm an assistant professor at HKU, and I'd like to ask you a question essentially concerning a role played by the non-elite, so to speak. Because your theory captures very aptly the bargain, the mindset, and also the rational choices for the elite. But where lies the non-elite? You know, if I were a member of, say, the middle class or the lower middle class, I'd like to influence policy decisions in the developmental bargain, so to speak. Can I actually influence it? Do I have a direct role to play, or is it instead merely through a responsive, almost passive, you know, taciturn role, and that's all that I could play really in constructing and shaping the trajectory here? And furthermore, do you see issues with the dichotomy between the elite and non-elite as an analytical framework, and might you not want to perhaps extend it to accounting for different forms and types of elite, as maybe C. Wright Mills does in his analysis of the power elite? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have another question over there. The gentleman over there, please.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for your speech. I'm Takif. It's actually my first day at Khazanah today. My question lies on the fact is on something that you've touched upon recently. I was wondering, in context in which state-society relations or even internal relations within a state, they are historically embedded and perpetuated, how do you then move forward? I think the question now becomes, for example, Srimanda Ngozi Adichie has talked a lot about how Nigeria's current politics is based on the Nigerian civil war between the Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba people. And as well as if you think about Ethiopia as well, thinking about how development is not always inclusive in terms of the Tigray region. So how then, when you have these historically embedded situations, do you move forward? Thank you.
Good. Shall I take this?
Yep.
So, well, thank you for these questions. They're all very difficult questions, you know. So let me, okay, I'll just take them in turn. So the first thing is that, you know, it's a risky business trying to reform a system. It's a risky business trying to actually progress to that next stage, as indeed you're referring to Myanmar and you refer to President Suharto as well. So, I mean, what is this part of the gamble? So, if I go a step back, it's quite striking that, so even in the Indonesian case, you know, quite a lot of the old business elite has survived this transfer, okay? In Myanmar, of course, even though when the liberal reforms were happening, there was very little attempt to actually change anything to do with the structure that the military was controlling as well. And actually, when they felt threatened, put it slightly differently, that part of the elite, even though they were not necessarily fully in power, their power was there and they flexed their muscle. And this is where it becomes really, okay, let me be honest, murky. This is why it's a deal, you know? And one of the things, indeed, I've been working with former advisors of the former prime minister in Myanmar and actually thinking about it, what could we have done differently? And what we could have done differently is actually this kind of really sad realization, especially if you used to work like me in a UK government department preaching the world. It's a sad realization, deals are murky. And whether it's in Sudan or whether it's in Myanmar, you can't deny that the military control the largest part of the economy. And overnight changing this, or trying to change this, will get that response. So this is a bit like where there's a elite bargain is murky. It's not pretty. You know, I'm not a fan of the elite. I'm very sorry for some of you. But I'm not a fan of it in saying that I think, oh, there's just enlightened in general. It's a realpolitik that we need to accommodate and know how to deal with it. And so in Myanmar, arguably you could say, by doing really great policies, they forgot the politics. And so they forgot who actually has the economic power. And so this is, again, it. In Suharto's case, you know, he ran its course and so on, but the business elite could maintain itself. And arguably, there's an element of renewal. So it's gambles here, and the stakes are high. And this is a bit like, you know, and I didn't dwell that much on it, you know, leadership comes into it, political leadership comes into it, is not to be just the enlightened leader with the great narrative alone, or the commander-in-chief with a forceful way of acting. It's to be the broker-in-chief. And actually, in most cases, successful politicians are great brokers, and they need to keep these broad coalition in society amongst the elite and other groups together. And so I think that's where the lesson comes. But it's risky business, you know. I'm very happy, maybe like you, to be an advisor and not having to take the decisions that is there. But it's there. Brian, thank you for your question, and this is a key point. Okay, so I already tried to say in the beginning, you know, I'm not somehow saying people shouldn't matter. The pressure from below matters. Okay. And for me, it's the minimal amount where you could say it, already mentioned that word, is saying legitimacy. You know, legitimacy of those of people in the elite, has to be by actually being sustained from below. And we know simple facts, and not for nothing I alluded to it on the inequality point. We know even IMF will write these days as country with too high inequality, where inequality is too high, it will hinder your growth, your progress. And it has a lot to do with the political economy of it. If the gaps become too high, you know, it's just the pressure, the legitimacy of those who make the decisions goes down. So the pressures, so the non-elite play a role. You know, I'm a cautious person, having worked through the period also of the Arab Spring, where not a single country in the Arab world is better off now after pressure from below. Because it's another power of the elite, or at least groups within the elite, is to capture. And the capture of uprising and so on. So maybe it fits also maybe better in Malaysia. Gradual change, but determined, probably works better, and to keep people with you. But people matter and non-elites matter. And I would encourage people to actually expect legitimacy. You know, if you're not part of this elite, expect legitimacy of it. Expect actually there. And this is a big role of civil societies in a lot of countries, that actually they bring accountability, they enforce external and internal accountability, and force the state to learn and to better. And I've seen this definitely in countries I've worked more intensively, like in Ghana or Kenya, that they've been a big part of making politics more responsible for delivery for people rather than for token measures and patronage. And then the final thing is that, I mean, we could speak for a very long time about it, but what you touch upon is somehow there are specific kind of constrained structural features, specificities about countries. And I think that's important. What I don't want to do is to say, a bit like why nations fail, history is everything. Actually, you need to be able not to just simply say Chinese history is like this, but you have to explain 1979. You have to explain the fall of Suharto in Indonesia. You have to explain maybe 2018 here. You need to explain moments of inflection points. An economic historian from Princeton put it very simply, and that helps me a lot. And he said, you know, when I look at the longer term and actually the success of nations today, probably 50% is history, 50% is agency. And I want to put that agency factor there. It's how people act today and interact and make the new deals and interactions, smaller and larger parts of the elite bargain, is what actually will determine the change. Not just structural factors that seem far away from yourself or actually unchangeable. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. And that was very impressive. And with this, it is the people today that will decide how we want to change. And on that note, thank you very much, Stefan, and we can put our hands together to thank him again.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Stefan and Xiaowan. Can we have both of you step forward for a photograph, please? Thank you both. Ladies and gentlemen, you may scan the QR code on screen